Shalom. I am Rabbi Miriam Spitzer of Temple Israel in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I am sharing the sermon that I delivered yesterday on Shabbat, February 17th, 2024. The sermon is called Israel and Our Conflicted Emotions. At the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., there is a short film that shows a Jewish inmate of a concentration camp praying. The Nazi guard on the other side of the fence was irritated at the sight of the inmate praying, and he shouted, "Yid, what are you doing?" The Jewish inmate responded, "I am thanking God." The Nazi guard was incredulous. "You are thanking God? Look at you. For what could you possibly be thanking God?" And the Jew replied, "I am thanking God that I am standing on this side of the fence and not in your place." Why do we have this exhibit in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.? It is not that we as Jews take some perverse pleasure at being the perpetual victim. It is not that we were glad to be behind barbed wire. It is not that we welcome anti Semitism. Any of those suggestions would be more than ludicrous. Rather, what we are is very proud of our moral stance as Jews. We take being Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations, extremely seriously. If there is any canon of Jewish faith, it is that God wants us to do good, to leave the world better than when we found it, to make a difference. We demand moral behavior from ourselves and from our fellow Jews. That is why we find ourselves cringing when we read of Jewish criminals on Wall Street or anywhere else. It is why we are proud of Jewish involvement in social justice organizations. And it is why we expect exemplary behavior from the state of Israel. We are not alone in the tendency to expect more from Jews and from Israel than we expect from other people and nations. The whole world expects more from the Jews and from Israel, leading to a frustrating double standard. No one seems to care when Arabs kill other Arabs or even when Arabs kill their own Arabs. But let Israel defend itself against Arab attackers, and world censure abounds. It is frustrating, but remember, we do it to ourselves too. We also expect more from Israel. So let us bite the bullet, word choice intended, and ask, how are we to respond to what is going on right now in Gaza? What should we, the American Jewish community, do right now? Yehuda Kurtzer is the head of the Shalom Hartman Institute in North America. In a January 29th article in the Jewish Forward, Yehuda Kurtzer identified 3 areas to which we must pay attention as we decide how to support this war. The 3 areas are 1, the rising death toll, 2, the fate of the hostages, and 3, can this war be won? In looking at these areas, I would like to tell you a few stories. My nephew Netanel recently got released from IDF reserve duty in Gaza. Among his jobs as a military engineer was the role of going into houses looking for weapons and entrances to tunnels. And he found them. Stockpiles of weapons in regular houses, in hospitals, in mosques, in schools, lots and lots of weapons and ammunition, and things I do not even have the right words for. This is not Netanel's opinion. This is fact that he saw with his own eyes. And then came the ceasefire in November, that wonderful time when we got about 100 of our 240 hostages back. The ceasefire lasted around a week. During that time, Netanyahu did not go into any Gazan houses. The mission was temporarily suspended. Then the ceasefire fell apart, and Netanyahu and the other soldiers started going back into Gazan houses. And guess what? They found far fewer stockpiles of weapons. The Gazans had had a week to move their armaments around, to hide them better, to make them harder to locate and to eradicate. Netanyahu's job got harder and much more dangerous. After that, he had to enter tunnels to find weapons, and entering tunnels is that much more dangerous than entering houses, which is plenty dangerous to start out with. Another story, also from Netanyahu. He recently took a cab ride in Israel. His cab driver was an Israeli Arab living in Israel, speaking flawless Hebrew. Netanyahu and the cabbie got to talking. The driver, who described himself as a non-religious Muslim, told Netanyahu that the Quran requires getting rid of the Jews in Israel, not just Gaza, not just the West Bank, but the Quran requires all of Israel to be Judenrein, according to this friendly Israeli Arab cab driver. And he, the driver, expects that to happen one day, and he expects to be part of it. Again, this is not Netanyahu's opinion. This is a conversation that he actually had in his cab ride. I asked Netanyahu why we need so much bombing in Gaza. I am still reeling from his response. Netanyahu said that in his opinion, yes, this is now Netanyahu's opinion, we did not have enough bombing in Gaza, especially in the beginning. Do you remember the beginning of the war? I do. I was very proud of Israel at the time. In order to reduce civilian casualties, Israel told the enemy exactly where they were going to be bombing and gave them time to leave their homes and their neighborhoods. Actually, Israel still does this sometimes. Civilians got out of the way, and terrorists who look like civilians, dress like civilians, interact with civilians, in fact, who often are civilians, terrorists also got out of the way, taking their guns, their ammunition, and the hostages with them. Drawing from his experience in Gazan houses before and after the ceasefire, as well as many other things that he saw, Netanyahu believes that if Israel had gone in, bombs falling, guns blazing, at the beginning, we would have captured more Hamas terrorists at the get-go. We would have rescued many more hostages before they were captive for months on end, and the war would have been over by now. We might have killed more innocent Gazans at the beginning, but since the war would have ended quicker, we might not have killed or displaced more in total. And who knows what the difference would have been in IDF lives. Folks, our greatest strength, that is our Jewish moral sense, Israel's policy of protecting civilians whenever possible, Israel's extreme care in warfare, our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness. And we wouldn't have it any other way. Another story. I was talking to my mother yesterday. She told me that before now, she had never known what it was to be truly afraid. Yeah, she might have said she was scared to drive on the highway, and there was that time that her car slid on the ice into an intersection. But true, sustained fear? In my 79 years of life, I had not felt true fear until I had to prepare a closed room with a brand new lock on the door and no idea if it would hold, wondering if my neighbors from the surrounding towns would be invading. That was fear. End quote. My mother is afraid for her life. And remember, she does not live in the Gaza envelope. She lives in Tekoa in the West Bank. Imagine the fear felt by those who did live near Gaza, on that horrible Shabbat Simchat Torah morning, the fear of those who live in Israel's north right now. And it's a different kind of fear, but we too, American Jews, are afraid. We are afraid that we do not know enough to respond to Israel's critics. We are afraid that some of the accusations against Israel might be true. We are afraid that the Netanyahu government might be working for their own personal self-interest or for values that we cannot endorse rather than working for the good of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. We are afraid. I want to share with you some words from Michael Oren, formerly Israel's ambassador to the U.S., as published in the Times of Israel on Thursday. Quote, "Every civilian death is a tragedy. Another country struck by the type and immensity of the atrocities committed against Israel, another country likely would have responded with vastly greater force and inflicted far greater numbers of civilian casualties. But Israel is the Jewish state, not only in the way we conduct our daily lives, but in the moral manner in which we defend ourselves. Even when the enemy is using its own population as a human shield, Israel must do its utmost to reduce the damage to civilians. This is not only a strategic interest for Israel, but also a moral imperative. The IDF takes unprecedented measures to warn civilians of impending actions and to evacuate them from combat zones. It's why, despite seemingly insurmountable obstacles, Israel has maintained the lowest combat to civilian casualty rate in modern warfare, as Hamas's own statistics show. Though Hamas is well known to grossly inflate its casualty figures, even the number of that number, 28,000 civilian deaths cited by the Gaza Health Ministry, actually proves Israel's case. The 28,000 includes the nearly 12,000 terrorists killed by the IDF. Deducting that number, as well as the civilian casualties caused by the 30% of Hamas rockets that fall short within the Gaza Strip, and the total will be roughly 13,000 civilian fatalities. That is a ratio of nearly one combatant death for every civilian, end quote. Michael Oren goes on to give statistics from other wars that show that Israel's ratio is unprecedentedly low. And then he says that the goal for terrorist to civilian fatality rates should always be 1 to 0. His words, Michael Oren's words, are well worth reading in their entirety, and I have some copies in the chapel if you would like one. I also want to share some words from an open letter to President Biden, written by mothers of IDF soldiers. Dear President Biden, we are an organization of mothers of IDF soldiers who are now serving on the front lines of the war for our national survival in Gaza, along the northern border, in Judea and Samaria, and along Israel's eastern frontier. We believe in our sons and daughters' mission to protect our state and our people. We are proud of their accomplishments and courage. We want to begin with our sincere thanks for your support during these challenging times. We accept the inherent risks that our sons and daughters take, but we cannot accept placing their lives in unnecessary danger due to concerns for the enemy population. Israel adheres to international law, which places responsibility for civilian lives on the terrorists who use them as shields, not on those justified in attacking the terrorists. There is no ethical or moral precedent of a just society that places a higher value on the lives of enemy civilians than on the lives of its own soldiers, and there can be none. Beyond that, it is now apparent that the Gazan people under Hamas are not receiving the humanitarian assistance. We have seen repeated scenes of the Hamas terrorists firing on civilians as they commandeer the aid trucks. As Gazans have repeatedly attested, the aid is not going to them. It is going to Hamas first and to Hamas accomplices second. For others to receive aid, they need to stand with Hamas and help it to fight against Israel. UNRWA, the UN agency in charge of distributing the aid, has been credibly accused of being wholly controlled and operating in the service of Hamas. As a result, the aid going into Gaza does the exact opposite of what you, President Biden, wanted to do. It enables Hamas to keep fighting by keeping Hamas terrorists supplied. The fuel going into Gaza enables Hamas terrorists to run their generators that keep air circulating in the underground tunnels, prolonging the war and placing our soldiers in unnecessary jeopardy. Secure as we are in your friendship, Mr. President, we are certain that this outcome is not the one you seek. In light of the above, we respectfully request A. Israel has to keep fighting until all of our war cabinet goals are achieved, Hamas is defeated, and our 136 hostages are freed. We do not want our sons and daughters to be called on to fight and risk their lives in another 6 months, or a year, or 2 years, because we did not finish the job today. This evil must vanish. B. No further entry of humanitarian aid or fuel that in actuality goes to Hamas. Shortening the life of Hamas to save our hostages and prevent numerous deaths and injuries on both sides is the true humanitarian act. C. Pressure be placed on the government of Egypt to prevent the civilians in Gaza who are stuck in the war zone to leave Gaza for refuge in third countries. End of quote. It is a strong and heartfelt letter. Again, it is worth reading in its entirety, and again, I have copies I could share with you in the chapel. The question that we asked at the beginning was, how are we, the American Jewish community, to respond to what is going on right now in Gaza? As Yehuda Kurtzer says, the challenge for liberals in this just war moment is to support the fight and hope it is fought justly and speedily. Now I'm talking for myself, not quoting anybody, I am convinced that the IDF is maintaining its high standards, at least most of the time. At the same time, I am glad that there are Israeli protesters who are saying that this war is not moral. I know that some people are aghast that there should be disagreements in the home front during a war, but I am not among them. The protesters are standing up for our values of Jewish morality and uprightness, and for that I applaud them, even though I would not join them. We are infused with the Jewish values of morality, of pidyon shvuim, rescuing hostages, of behaving in accordance with God's guidelines. And hence our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness, because our enemies know that we are infused with the Jewish values of morality, of pidyon shvuim, rescuing hostages, of adhering to international law even in warfare, and that there are things that we will not do and lines that we will not cross. They also know about the double standard to which the world holds us and to which we hold ourselves. As American Jews, we have the right to demand justice from Israel. We do not have the right to demand that Israel value the lives of its enemies above the lives of its own citizens and soldiers. That would be outrageous. Similarly, we do not have the right to demand that Israel take into account President Biden's approval ratings in its security decision making. Can we possibly think it's reasonable to ask Israelis to risk their lives and the lives of their children because some Democrats threaten not to vote for Biden if they don't? That too would be outrageous. Instead, we must speak up. talking to our friends, telling everybody what is really going on. We must do what we can to ensure that support for Israel remains a bipartisan issue and that Biden does not suffer from his moral stance. Biden has been steadfast. We must speak accordingly, we must vote accordingly, but we cannot ask Israelis to pay with their lives and their security. We must have the Israelis' backs in this. And we must continue to ask the tough questions. We cannot assume that because Israel does it, it must be just. We must make sure that Israel continues to wage war in a just manner. We cannot let ourselves become like Hamas. We cannot become the Nazi on the other side of the fence. If that were to happen, the whole enterprise would have been for naught. Am Yisrael Chai. Amen.